So, welcome everyone to this first ever MPOD webinar. I recently found out that half of the questions in experience sampling or in ecological momentary assessment are slider questions. So I thought it would be a good idea to do a deep dive into the slider question. Because let me be clear from the beginning, not all slider questions are created equally. So what do I mean with a slider question, also known as a visual analog scale? Well, obviously a question, and underneath that question there will be some kind of slider. And such questions are, at least in experience sampling or daily diaries, most often shown on a smartphone. First, I will talk about how much a slider question is exactly used compared to other question types, and then I will talk about the pros and the cons of a slider. Subsequently, I will give some ideas to counter these cons. I will end the webinar with a quick demonstration on how the slider scale can best be used in the MPOD platform. So the first thing I wanted to know is how much is this slider scale actually used? And to find an answer, I analyzed the last million of questionnaires that have been answered using MPOD, the MPOD platform, in daily diaries, experience sampling questions, ecological momentary assessment questions, and so on. So in all these million questionnaires, about 50% of all the questions were slider scales or visual analog scales. 45% of the questions were multiple choice questions, Likert questions, single choice questions, yes/no questions, and so on. 2% were open questions, like open text questions, and then 3% were still other kind of question types, more kind of specialized kind of question types. So slider question is the most used question in daily diaries and experience sampling questionnaires, and I actually think that it is quite remarkable, because when we look at the history of psychological questionnaires, like this old school depression scales, personality questionnaires, psychopathology questionnaires, they almost all constantly use Likert questions. So here you see the depression scale, the CSD, and participants could use how much something happened to them during the past week. And the options were less than 1 day, 1 to 2 days, 3 to 4 days, 5 to 7 days, typical Likert scale. And this is true for almost all personality questionnaires, validated personality questionnaires, depression scales, and so on. And this, of course, because when those questionnaires were made, all the questionnaires were filled in with pen and paper. And with pen and paper, it's very difficult to actually use a slider scale. But once participants were filling in more and more questions on a computer, on a smartphone, we see that that slider scale immediately became the most well-known or the most used question type in psychological research, as we see here on this graph. So what does make the slider scale so attractive? Why do all these researchers use the slider scale in their research? Well, I think the biggest advantage, the biggest pro is, of course, that you have a very high resolution. Typical slider scale goes from 0 to 100, 0 to 1000, or whatever. At least it has a very high resolution. For example, a slider from 0 to 100 has, of course, 101 possibilities, while a typical Likert scale only has 4, 5, or 7 answer options. You can never get such a high resolution by just using a Likert scale or a single choice questionnaire. So you can never find this high resolution in Likert scales. And second of all, it's still very user-friendly, intuitive. Participants immediately know how to kind of use this scale. And last, of course, it leads to quantitative information, and this is, of course, very important when you're doing quantitative research. Now, what are the disadvantages? What are the cons? I think this is also related to the very high resolution. It's not always clear what each answer option means. So, for example, you have the question how sad are you now from 0 to 100? What does 70 sadness mean? What does 80 sadness means? I mean, you have all these answer options from 0 to 100, but it's not always clear for the participant what they actually mean. And also, different participants may look different or may interpret the scale different from each other. So this, of course, in turn can introduce really a lot of noise to the questions, which makes it much more difficult to analyze the results, to analyze the data. A last problem is that it's a bounded scale, but it's not really different from other scales like Likert scale, which is equally bounded. The problem here is, again, let's say I have a question: how sad are you now from 0 to 100? Let's say I'm feeling very, very sad. I'm feeling 100 sad out of 100. And then in the meantime, something really bad happened. For example, my cat died, and I feel even worse. But of course, it is something I cannot indicate in a bounded scale. I was already at 100 of sadness, so I cannot indicate that I'm actually feeling worse than previous time. And this is always kind of a problem with these bounded scales and makes it sometimes difficult to analyze variability. There is not really a good solution for this. However, luckily there is quite a good solution, or it's kind of possible to counter the first two disadvantages. So to make it easier for participants to interpret the whole scale. So in general, we want to make sure that participants can actually interpret the scale. And I think there are three solutions to do so. The first thing is to add text to the slider that indicates the meaning to participants. So what do I mean with this? Let's go to a quick questionnaire. So this is a very general slider. How stressed are you now? And participants can fill it in from 0 to 100. But here they only see the number, they only see the slider. So it's very difficult for the participant to know what is actually meant with stress 64. So that's probably not really a good slider. It's easy to kind of make the slider already a bit better by, for example, adding some kind of anchors, not at all too extreme. So at least now the participant knows what the extreme points of the slider means. They go from not at all to extremely. And of course, I mean, we can even add more words, for example, also something in the middle, more text in the middle. Now we know that the middle means a neutral amount of stress. Unfortunately, there is only that much of space here on the slider, and we cannot just keep adding in more text to kind of show what the slider means. There is, however, an easy solution for this. You can just add some text on top that actually moves or changes together with the slider. For example, here we have a slider that goes from no stress to worst stress possible, and when you move the slider, the text on top of the slider actually changes. You see moderate stress, severe stress, very severe stress, worst stress possible. So now the participant knows for each chunk or each part of the slider what it actually means. And I think this can really already help the participants to know to interpret the slider. We call this a Likert scale because it's kind of a combination between a slider and a Likert scale. A second solution is to add visuals instead of text to the slider. And I think the best way to do so is to use some kind of animated visuals to the slider. So let's show how this could look like in or on a phone. So here we have again the question, how stressed are you now? But now when we move the slider, we see that the smiley on top of it kind of animates and again shows the meaning of the slider. It kind of has the same goal as text to show kind of what each part of the slider means. So we can see it goes kind of from a neutral phase to a very stressed phase. And the additional advantage here is that it's a bit more nice for participants to look at. It's also very intuitive, I think. However, the added problem here is that maybe not everybody would interpret the smiley face again in the same way. A A last improvement is to add meaningful anchors to the scale. So let me immediately show what I mean with this. So here we can go to the next question, and here we can see a point and it annotates last. So this is the last answer or the previous answer of the participant. So the previous time the participant filled in this questionnaire, he or she answered 70 out of 100 for this stress scale. And this gives participants a way to answer relatively to themselves. So you add an anchor to the scale that is really personalized. So it kind of adapts the question to the participants themselves. Another possibility would, for example, be to add the average stress level of the participant. So the participant can always say, like, is he more or less average stressed than his or her average self. And Egon de Jong here and me actually did research on this using this annotation of the last measurement, and we find that when we use it, that the data quality actually slightly improves, but I mean not that much. But more importantly, participants really like it more. They think it's more intuitive to have these added personalized anchors to the questionnaire. So now you can, as you can see, really use this slider relatively to yourself. So in the final part of this webinar, we will talk about how to implement this slider scale in MPOT and change all the settings to counter the disadvantages we previously talked about. So we have here a question, how stressed are you now? Here is the question or statement. We have it labeled stress, and it is indeed a slider type. And now we can change the settings. We have general settings, specific settings, and curate settings. And here we will mainly focus on the specific settings. These are settings that are specifically made for the slider scale. So let's first look at the question, and to do so we can easily click here on this eye and we can get kind of an emulator in the MPOT platform. So here we see how stressed are you now, and it ranges from not at all to extremely. These are kind of standard anchors and they are translated into the language of the phone of the participant. The first thing we can change is the range. Now it goes from 0 to 100. So from 0 to 100, we can easily change this to go from 0 to 1000, 0 from 1000. But you can also make it smaller. And when the range becomes smaller or equal to 11, then the slider becomes actually discrete. And now it goes from 0, as you can see, to 10. And it looks already a bit more like a Likert scale. The next thing we can do is customize anchors. So now we have this default anchors going from not at all to extremely, but we can also use our own anchors, let's say from left to right. I mean, this is not something you would actually use in a real question, but it really shows what it does. So now it goes from left to right. Let's also change the range back from 0 to 100. So now we have a scale that goes from left to right. With from 0 to 100. Next thing you can do, you can also add a middle anchor. So this would add more text in the middle. You can also hide the position number when sliding. So now you can see 75 on top. When I check this, well, there will be no number anymore on the top. I have had a lot of discussions about this specific setting. So when to use it, when not to use it. Well, in the end, I think it probably doesn't really matter that much if you actually show or don't show the number. But I think, I mean, my personal opinion is that it's better to show it, because then a participant has at least the possibility to use this number to give as much accuracy as possible. The next thing you can choose is annotate last answer. I will show this not on the emulator on the platform, but on a more real phone. So what happens here? When you fill in the questionnaire, how stressed are you now? You see the last measurement of the participant. So now it's 49. Let's say I fill in 94. And then the next time I fill in the questionnaire, I will see that it actually starts at 94. You see? Now I move it to 8, I fill it in again, and the next time I fill it in, it starts at 8. So now a participant can really fill in this questionnaire relative to him or herself. Using this, we can also show a midpoint, a little line in the middle to really show what's on the left and what's on the right. And then we also have the slider start system. As you can see, by default, it starts at 50, and participants have to kind of change the slider to be able to go to the next question. The problem with this is that participants often just slightly do it to the right or slightly to the left. And this will give you kind of a bimodal distribution, so a bit on the right side of 50, a bit on the left side of 50, and sometimes it's a bit difficult to analyze. I think it's better to just use annotate last answer, so that it actually starts with the last answer. Then you don't have really that problem anymore of like really a fixed midpoint in the middle leading to bimodal distribution. But another thing that we often use is an empty start. So we just put in empty, and now the slider just starts in empty, and the participant has to click somewhere, anywhere on the slider. The disadvantage of this is that, it's not always clear what the slider means. When you don't have like this slider not thing, then it's sometimes difficult. Well, what does the participant need to do here? Although most participants also easily understand this empty slider start system. Next thing you can do is also add words on top of it, like I showed before. So let's say left, middle, right, and these are then the slider option that can automatically change with the slider. So let's show this. Let me see. We need an empty start system, so this will be better. Okay, so now it goes from left, it automatically goes to the middle, and then it goes to the right. And this automatically changes with the slider that is changed, and you can add as many words or text that have to appear on top of it to make it kind of as accurate or interpretable as possible. You can do something very similar with images. So instead of words, you can now use images. So for example, I have 3 arousal pictures. This has no arousal. This has some arousal, and this has a lot of arousal. So we can just add those. So I can now add these images here to the image locations. Voila. Let's also test this on a real phone, and you can see how the images are downloaded. You can find more on our manual on how to actually use images in MPOT. So now the images are downloaded, and now you can see that this image also automatically changes with the slider. I think something like this is even more interesting than using words. And the last thing I wanted to show you is that it's also possible to use smileys, like I showed before. We have many different smileys here in MPOT. Let's see at all the smiley questions. We have feeling, surprise, happy, angry, sad, fear, stress, disgust, and some kind of battery. And they all change together with the slider. So let's send it to the phone. Voila, here now I have the stress smiley. It goes from 0, neutral face, to 100, a very stressed face. But we can also use another kind of smiley. Let's, for example, take a valence smiley. This goes from negative to positive. Also test it on a real phone. Voila, it goes from negative to positive. Of course, we should still change the question here on top. So I think these are all the settings you can change, or most important settings you can change in MPOT with regards to the slider question. You can find a lot about this also in the manual. Feel free to explore it and let us know if you have any other ideas which you think could be which you think could still improve the slider question in MPOT.